Greetings. Welcome to another episode of a user's review of the excellent Canon XC15 XC10. Our previous 3 episodes have been on exposure, and this is the 4th episode on exposure. In those previous episodes, I mainly concentrated on showing you what an advantage it is to be able to shoot in semi-automatic mode, specifically on the XC10, XC15, specifically shooting in TV mode. And the reason being that the camera arrives at beautiful auto exposure quicker and better than you ever could shooting in manual. And I mentioned in one of those videos that there is no exposure compensation or exposure lock that you can use when you're shooting in TV mode. Well, I was informed by Graham Taylor, who's one of the members of our XC10, XC15 Facebook group, that I was in fact incorrect, that the exposure lock and exposure compensation that we have in the function menu is actually applicable to video. Now, I had seen it there, but I just assumed that it was only applicable to shooting stills. But I was happily incorrect. And so I began to work with shooting in exposure lock in different occasions, different instances outside, and it works like a dream. So thank you very much, Graham, for correcting my error there. Now let me show you how to access exposure lock and how to use exposure compensation with exposure lock to freeze your exposure when you need to, when you're shooting outside doing run and gun. So here we are outside on a nice, beautiful summer evening in Texas, and I'm going to show you how to access your exposure lock. First, you're going to go into your function menu, so press Func, and there you are. But where is the exposure lock? There it is, with a little asterisk, and you press the asterisk and you see that the M there will brighten up, and if you press it again, then you'll see the bar appear, and then your exposure is locked. Now if you press the function toggle switch down, then you see the orange appears there, and now you can compensate your exposure if that's what you want to do. So you can move it up or down one way or the other. We're not going to be actually shooting, so I'm overexposing, but it doesn't really matter. So there we are. I'm going to go plus 1/2, plus 1, whatever. It doesn't really matter. And the way you get back to your main screen, just do plus 1/2. The way you get back to your main screen is press the menu button twice. There. And there you see appearing on your screen, you see the exposure compensation sign because we're plus 1/2. And then there's our asterisk telling us that the exposure is locked at plus 1/2. And so you'll be able to shoot away like that. So as you can see here, we begin in exposure lock and exposure compensation. We press on our toggle switch and press on the asterisk. The scale appears. If we press up, then you see the waveform brightens up. And then if you press to the left, push to the left, the M brightens up. And if you push in, then you see the bar disappears. And when the bar disappears, you are shooting in semi-automatic TV mode again. To double check that, double press the menu, and there you see we got a plain old screen and we're shooting in plain old TV mode. So there you go. How cool is that? Well, when are you going to use this outside shooting run and gun? When are you going to use exposure lock and exposure compensation? Well, on days when you have a lot of sun and shadows, because clouds are passing, and in between the clouds, instead of having it overcast, you have bright sunlight hitting you, hitting what you're shooting, you're going to have a lot of exposure contrast in between shots that you cannot plan. So then it's a perfect time that you're going to want to use your exposure lock. Other places is when you're doing a sweep or a pan and you know you're going from one exposure change to another, or when you're going from inside to outside, you're going to have to plan your shot. You can still shoot in TV mode and get the shot that you want. Now, the question one might ask is that, well, if you're going to do that, why don't you just shoot in full manual? Well, you could do that. I mean, I've done that before. Anyone can do that. But I would advise you to experiment with shooting in TV mode, in the semi-automatic mode, and then using the exposure lock and see how it works for you. For me, it's much quicker. And the primary reason is because of the blinding speed that the camera arrives at perfect exposure in TV mode. It's really something. It's faster than I could ever do it, and more accurate than I could ever do it in most occasions, on most occasions. So being able to switch back and forth, once you get some facility, being able to switch back and forth between the semi-automatic TV mode into exposure lock and back and forth is very, very quick. So, and I find that it's just as good, if not better, than anything I can do hunting around to get correct exposure in full manual. So I find that I get my shots quicker and I get them better when I'm shooting in this semi-automatic mode. It just takes a little practice, and I think if you do that, that you might, in doing run and gun, you might almost completely abandon shooting in full manual mode and leave that only for shooting in studio. That's a personal choice, of course, but for me, I think it's pretty clear that the camera is more efficient in run and gun, and you get better and more shots, better exposed shots, and you get them done more quickly and framed better when you're not fooling around in full manual mode trying to arrive at just the right exposure and so on and so forth. There is one thing, though, that you do have to watch out about if you decide you're going to use exposure lock and use it with some, use it extensively. And that is what happens when you turn the camera off. Now, if you're like me, you turn the camera off a lot of times between shots for the obvious reasons that it saves battery life. But when you turn the camera back on, what happens is that you lose all your settings in your exposure lock. So when I was first trying to familiarize myself with using this technique back and forth between the semi-automatic mode, I would shoot for 10 or 15 seconds and then realize, oh, I'm no longer in exposure lock. So then I would lose my shot, and I would have to start back over and get my exposure lock, and get my settings. That's very frustrating until you get used to it. But you just have to know that when you turn that camera off, if you're wanting to shoot with exposure lock, you're going to have to reset it when you start the camera again. Either that or just leave the camera on and don't worry about battery life. Just carry enough batteries with you so that you won't run out during a shoot. This is kind of frustrating because, for instance, when you're shooting in teleconversion, when you go to teleconversion and you lock that in, then when you turn the camera off, you turn it back on, it stays in teleconversion. It doesn't wipe it out. And I just don't understand exactly why Canon decides to wipe out your exposure lock and exposure compensation when you turn the camera on and off. But when you're shooting in teleconversion, it keeps it on. You don't lose it. If you're going to shoot in teleconversion, turn the camera off and turn it back on, if you want to be out of teleconversion, you're going to have to go there and actually physically shut teleconversion off. The camera will not shut it off for you, but it definitely does that for exposure lock. So just be aware that's happening, and you won't be like me losing shots in the beginning trying to learn how to do this. So in closing, I'd just like to share with you a few very obvious things in terms of what are good habits when you are dealing with exposure and exposure lock and exposure compensation. And the primary good habit that you have with the XC15 is a habit of always making reference to your waveform. Your waveform is going to really tell you what your best exposure is and help you make the right judgment, even when you can't really see things well properly enough on the screen to make a real solid judgment. So always use the waveform. And in reference to that, you'll notice that when you start shooting, start recording, you'll notice the waveform disappears. Well, I like my waveform on as much as possible unless it's obstructing something important on the screen. So I have it programmed on one of the side buttons. So as soon as you press record, the waveform disappears. You can press your button that toggles in the waveform, and boom, it's right back on the screen, and it'll stay on the screen all the time that you're shooting and recording until you're ready to shut it down yourself. So I think that's a very important feature to remember. The other thing is to use your zebras, especially outside. You want to use your zebras at 100, and inside, of course, with the skin tones, you want to use your zebras down around 70 or 80. So those are good habits to always maintain when you're working with exposure. Just don't trust what the screen says and make a judgment from your eyes, because your eyes can deceive you, as we all know when we're dealing with video. So those are good habits to remember, and practice this, see how it works for you. I hope it's helpful to you, and until we do another video, thanks for watching. And if you have any comments, any criticisms, or any corrections, please record them down below so I can see them and other people can see them as well.